I know for a fact, looking back on my long career, that I could probably have got elected on a number of occasions if I had two or three particularly radical points to put across. But I think we have to be more responsible than that. And therefore, I don't like the rhetoric from the Home Secretary. And I think we should tone that down and just get on with becoming more efficient.
So look, there's Suella Braveman threatening signalling on membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. And we're told the Prime Minister wants to send a signal warning off the European Court of Human Rights, dangling the possibility of withdrawal. What do you make of the government's approach?
Well, I think the thing they mustn't do is to attack the basic building blocks, either in relation to the Convention on Human Rights or more particularly on the 51 Refugee Convention of the United Nations, because they both are the very basis of how we can, within the rule of law internationally, deal with the movement of people. I mean, the original idea, of course, back in 1949, when the 51 Convention, the Refugee Convention, was being considered, was we had loads of people, millions of people all over Europe displaced by the Second World War. And in fact, the major ingredient of that was not so much to give asylum on a permanent basis to people, but to try and relocate them back to where they ought to be, i.e. to their own nations. And it has developed over the years. But what I would say is this. The argument the government puts up is that we don't like the look of this because it might affect our Rwanda policy. The Rwanda policy seems to be the sort of vital ingredient, which I believe is unnecessary and actually harmful to our reputation internationally, but also not going to have the effect that the government wants. I'm myself very strongly of the view that the basis of the Refugee Convention is sufficient to deal with the asylum applications we have if we put the resources into actually dealing with them. And that's what we failed to do, because the convention only has two areas where people can be granted asylum. One is if they're in immediate threat as for their lives, or alternatively, that if they return to the country where they've come from, they will find themselves permanently incarcerated. And that actually is a very difficult bar to get over. Most people, when I was minister in the 90s, did not get over it. 85% of the people that applied did not meet those criteria. And we returned very large numbers of people, both to parts of Europe, but also more widely around the world. And if countries didn't want to take them back, they were obliged to do so, as far as we were concerned. So I feel myself that we're going about this entirely the wrong way, attacking those basic building blocks, which I think are vital and terribly important and signed up to by just about all the respectable nations in the world.
Okay, I hear your argument, and I completely comprehend the argument that if Britain were to walk away from the European Convention on Human Rights, it would put them on the outside of what you see as the club of civilized nations, and Britain, you argue, deserves to be and should be in that club. I also wonder, listening to you there carefully, Tim, are you also acknowledging that the European Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention behind it, they were drafted for an earlier time? We do now live in an era of mass migration, of peoples fleeing from hardship and danger from many, many different sources, conflict, climate change and natural disasters, persecution broadly defined. If it was all if it all added up to a claim to asylum, Tim, the system would it not, arguably, as Suella Braveman argues, simply be unmanageable?
No, John, it's quite the reverse of that, actually, because the Refugee Convention, its basic principles, are extremely difficult to meet. And that, of course, is very important when we're talking about the numbers of people moving around the world, some of whom are alleged to be moving for economic reasons. Well, they can immediately be dealt with on that basis. So it's a very high bar. We just don't seem to be now implementing the basic principles. If we went back, instead of getting rid of those basic principles and going into unknown territory where we're looking at a much more sort of subjective basis for refugees, if we stuck with the principles, we could deal with people in a much more effective and a faster way, and a fair way too. Because when I was minister in the 90s, I introduced the term firm but fair into our immigration policies. And that's exactly how we used to do it, and how I believe we should still do it now. So I'm sorry, but, it's quite the reverse. The actual Refugee Convention, anyway, was updated in the 60s to reflect the changes, that is, the people who were displaced were then returned to their countries. And then we were looking at movements in one direction, that is, migrants coming mostly to Western European countries or to Europe. And we did alter it then. The protocol came in, but we kept those basic principles because they stood the test of time. And simply saying, for one particular domestic policy, we now will get rid of these, what can I say, these important principles and these important building blocks, including also the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights, is ludicrous. And can I just add one final thing on that? If they're threatening, and groups of my colleagues in the Conservative Party keep on threatening that we should leave the ECHR, first of all, some of them, I'm afraid, still got hang-ups about Brexit and seem to think it's something to do with the EU. Of course, it's not. It's the Council of Europe. It was set up before the EU, long before, and has very many countries in it that have nothing to do with the EU. But also, if we were to walk away from that, not only would we be out of the Council of Europe, but also it would destroy the whole peace agreements in Northern Ireland and a number of other things in which we're signed up to as well.
Well, the objections, indeed, the objections are stacked. I've said many times in the past that an attempt to withdraw from the European Convention would run into huge obstacles, not least in your own party in the House of Commons, to say nothing of the House of Lords, where there would be an arguably insurmountable barrier erected by peers on all sides. Kate McCann's here.
Can I just ask, I mean, it sounds like listening to you that you are saying, something similar to the government, or Suella Braveman at least, in that maybe there is an over-interpretation of these conventions, and actually they are much tougher than some people suggest, which leaves me with the question, whose fault is it that the UK government is not doing what you suggest they are perfectly able to do already?
Well, I think it is the fault of the UK government, but governments, plural, because this is something that's been happening now for quite a number of years. We changed our whole approach, for instance, to so-called safe and legal routes. So we made effectively a more illegal situation for asylum seekers by closing down the opportunities through our embassies and consulates right around the world for individuals or small groups who had reason to claim asylum to be able to apply there. We closed all that down. We also changed the view, I think, of our officials. I think our officials have been looking more broadly than with those two principles. They've been looking at people and thinking, well, he says he will be discriminated against if he goes, but not really testing it properly. And frankly, those two things are so straightforward that it is possible to test them. And I believe that over the years, you just have to look at the figures now. Someone said that something like 75% of applications, when they're made in this country right now, are not, they're not fake. They're actually genuinely meeting our requirements. Well, I don't believe that they are meeting the requirements of the Refugee Convention, but I think as a matter of convenience, sometimes perhaps maybe to speed up a case or something, they are being accepted and people are being admitted. So I'm not taking a soft line on this at all. I think we have to stop those boats, but I think we have to do it in a way which actually makes sense to people of all persuasions.
Okay,
and at the moment,
so now you're suggesting, Tim, that
rhetoric, nothing else.
So now, Tim, you are suggesting that a number of people who are granted asylum in this country are not genuinely deserving of asylum. They're being allowed in as an administrative convenience, and then you have those who are refused asylum. What would you do with those people? Now the government wants to send them to Rwanda. That option is closed at the moment. For all we know, it may stay closed. What would you do with those people? Because there aren't countries other than Albanians that will take people back.
We have quite a lot of clout through our international aid processes and in other ways with an awful lot of countries which are claiming to be free and democratic and full of human rights. We got a lot of clout if we want to use it against them. And I think when I was minister, I think we had to, on one or two occasions, make it quite clear that if people did not take back those who had failed to meet the criteria for asylum, then there would be consequences for their future relationship with this country.
Who would you force to take asylum seekers back?
How? Sorry, I'm sorry, John.
Which countries would you apply that pressure to? Who would you make take asylum seekers back, failed asylum seekers?
Well, there's quite a lot of countries in parts of Africa, for instance, where I believe we have had the flows change, week to week. So sometimes you get large numbers of people coming from one country altogether, because the people traffickers, of course, work on countries one by one. And they behave appallingly, and those people should be dealt with very firmly too. But there are a lot of countries. I don't want to name a specific country now because it changes in numbers. We had a very good arrangement. Albania, I congratulate the government on doing a deal with Albania to make sure that people who failed to get the criteria from there would be returned and accepted. But I mean, if you take a look at other people's experiences on this, the United States is not an ideal one. I've examined that very carefully and been there and checked it out with Mexico. But I mean, the truth of the matter is that if people will not take back people and they want to be part of the world, forums and so on, claiming how respectable they are and so on, then that is unacceptable. It's internationally unacceptable. And I think we should work internationally with our colleagues in Europe and elsewhere to try and make sure that the countries that will not receive their own citizens back, who have not got reason to flee from there, will be dealt with internationally. And I think that's where our pressure should be, rather than playing around with the basic principles which have stood the test of time and where, frankly, our reputation is on the line.
Kate McCann.
Can I ask you, just stepping back a little bit from some of the sort of nuts and bolts of immigration policy, how you feel about the language used by the Home Secretary, Suella Braveman? For example, multiculturalism has failed. Some of the language that she used in her speech in Washington was very difficult, even for some of your colleagues in the Tory party to hear. How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, the audience in Washington, particularly with right-wing think tanks, can be a little bit rich at times. But on the other hand, I do feel that where we're getting this really wrong, immigration, is that we seem to be rhetoric heavy, but in practical terms, rather light. And it worries me enormously. It does appeal to a certain audience in this country. Rhetoric always goes down. I mean, I know for a fact, looking back on my long career, that I could probably have got elected on a number of occasions if I had 2 or 3 particularly radical points to put across. But I think we have to be more responsible than that. And therefore, I don't like the rhetoric from the Home Secretary. And I think we should tone that down and just get on with becoming more efficient, but also using international levers in order to sort this out.
Last question, just a very brief question and a very brief answer if I could, because I'm taking too long over this, Tim, but that's what I do. It is an important and interesting subject. You effectively tell us that Suella Braveman's tough rhetoric is irresponsible. Is it, however, politically productive? Will it yield votes for your party?
That's a very, very difficult question, John. It's an unfair question, really, because it may well do so in certain parts of our country and our community.
Will it be a net gain, I guess?
I don't think it's a net gain in the end. I think it's unproductive because at the end of the day, that rhetoric still isn't going to stop the votes. And I want to stop the votes. I think most of us talking about this want to stop people suffering in the Channel, and we want to do it in a grown-up way. But rhetoric doesn't do it.